All right, today we're going to start talking about proofs of triangle congruence. So we've talked about proofs before when we were doing our angle pairs and the general structure. And really we're trying to make an argument for why two things would be the same. In our case, we're going to try to prove that two triangles are congruent. So here it says given AB is parallel to DC. So let's mark that on here. AB was parallel to DC. We could say, and they said, therefore, angle 1 is congruent to angle 2 because they'd be alternate interior. And we could also say 3 and 4 are congruent, but that's not necessarily because they're parallel, it's just because they're vertical angles. Vertical angles are always congruent. Given E is the midpoint of AD and BC, so these would be like your starting points for proofs. We're not doing a full proof right now. If E is the midpoint of AD and BC, and I think these are all separate thoughts here, then we could say that BE is congruent to CE and AE is congruent to DE. That might come in handy for our triangle congruency because then you could say some sides are congruent. So let's say BE is congruent to EC and AE is congruent to DE, and we would say that's by definition of midpoint. Given triangle BAE is congruent to triangle CDE, so again, let's start over here. We're saying our left-hand triangle is congruent to our right-hand triangle. So then we could say any of the parts are congruent. So we could say a whole bunch of things, actually. We could say angle B is congruent to angle C. We could say angle A is congruent to angle D. Angle E is congruent to angle E. And then we could do sides. BA is congruent to CD. AE is congruent to DE. And BE is congruent to CE. So that would be all 6 of our parts. And we would say that is because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Okay, so we use this as our abbreviation. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. All right. Number 2, given RP is parallel to MQ, I could say that this angle is congruent to this one, or that this angle is congruent to this one. Because of alternate interior angles. So let's name those. For my red ones, I have QRM is congruent to PMR by alternate interior. Remember, you always need a reason. And for my blue ones, I have PRM is congruent to RMQ for the same reason. Given RQ is parallel to PM, so the opposite set of sides, again, I would have the same angles. So I don't need to erase those necessarily. Okay, and then it's going to be the same thing. Okay, number 3 here. Given that line segment YO bisects angle XYZ, that would tell us that these two angles have to be congruent. That's the definition of an angle bisector. So we would do angle QYO is congruent to angle ZYO by definition of angle bisector. Given O is the midpoint of XZ would tell us that XO is congruent to ZO by the definition of midpoint. All right, number 4, given RM bisects angle PRQ. So this is bisecting angle PRQ. That's going to say that these two are the same. So angle PRM is congruent to MRQ by definition of angle bisector. Oops. All right, given RM bisects angle MQP, so this angle down here, we can say that angle QMR is congruent to angle PMR by the same reason, definition of angle bisector. So really you want to use your given to help you figure out your next step, and then we are trying to build a proof, and usually trying to either say that two triangles are congruent, or even taking that one step further to say that two pieces of that triangle are congruent. And actually it looks like we missed one right here. Given YO is perpendicular to XZ, it's going to tell us that these two angles are right angles. So we could say that angle XOY is 90 and angle ZOY is 90 by definition of perpendicular. Okay, then you could also take it a step further and say that these are congruent using the transitive property. All right, next page. So, looks like we're just doing a little bit more of what we were doing before. PQ is parallel to RT. So that means I could say that these two are congruent. What else? That might be it. I think that's it. So we would say angle QP T is congruent to angle PTR. Alternate interior is our reason. Okay, given MQ is parallel to PT, MQ is parallel to PT. So now I'm looking at this being my transversal. Let's see. Okay. So if this was my transversal of these two parallel lines, I believe this angle and this angle would be congruent because they're alternate interior. So similar reason, MQR is congruent to QPT by alternate interior angles. P is the midpoint of MR. So if we're saying that P is the midpoint of MR, that means we can say MP is congruent to RP by definition of midpoint. Okay, down below here is what we call a proof shopping list. So remember, to prove something's congruent, you need one of these 3 big theorems, or there's the 2 that kind of fall under the same umbrella, like this falls under angle, side angle, and this falls under side, side, side. But these are our big 3 that you want to keep in mind. And then you're usually either trying to prove that things are congruent by using one of these 3 criteria, or you're taking it a step further than that and using your corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent to say 2 specific pieces are the same. Definition of midpoint, so this is kind of a list of reasons. So definition of midpoint's a big one we'll use. Definition of perpendicular would help you say that things are 90 degrees. Angle bisectors help you say that two angles would be the same, vertical angles are always congruent, and linear pair, remember, would mean that they add to 180. Parallel lines create congruent angles. Alternate interior is one that pops up all the time. Corresponding alternate exterior are also choices. Parallel lines mean same side interior angles are supplementary. But again, I think we end up using alternate interior the most of that group. Reflexive property means that two things are the same. So like when we are saying HL has to be congruent to HL because it's the exact same segment, we would say the reflexive property for things like that. Transitive property you've seen before. It's when two things are equal, two sets of things are equal, then they're equal to each other. And then substitution is if A equals B, then B can be substituted in for A. So they're similar but not exactly the same. So transitive property you're using to kind of cut out a middleman. Substitution property is when you're putting something in for something else. So this is our proof shopping list. So today's assignment, you're kind of just thinking about what other information you would need to complete the triangle congruent statement, and then the rest of our worksheets are going to focus on proofs. So we will get a lot of practice with proofs this week. So you are working on worksheet 4 today in your packet.